I'm Sue Berkey. I'm the Vice President of the Historical Society. And this is our very first Zoom monthly meeting. So this is a great experiment for us. Just a couple of quick announcements before I introduce our speaker. The old jail is open by appointment. Best thing to do is check our website because there are cool things going up on the website. We're doing an online art show instead of our in-person art show this month. That'll be running from January 30th to February 20th, local artists. We have another Zoom meeting on February 25th. The speaker will be Bob Thomas, and he'll be speaking about America 250, the preparations for the 250th anniversary of 1776, which is kind of amazing to me. So we hope you'll join us for that. That's about all I've got for announcements for right now. So we're going to go right into our speaker. Our speaker is Beth Sansbury. She's the author of several books. She's from Virginia. And she's traced the history of the Sully Historical Site. That's hard to say. Sully Historical Site, I got it that time, in Fairfax County, Virginia. And her latest book is Searching for Sully's Enslaved. And she's going to be speaking to us tonight on how that relates to Chambersburg history. So I'm just going to let her start and tell you all about that now. Beth?
Okay. Yes, my name is not David. This is my husband's computer.
I figured that out.
Yeah, first, who I am. I must admit, I am not a professional historian. My career, in fact, was as an economic intelligence analyst and manager for 35 years at CIA. When I retired, I first went to be a docent at Smithsonian's Galleries of Asian Art because I loved Asian art so much. But then when the traffic got too bad, I said, I've got to find something local. So I knew about Sully Historic House, where I had taken my Girl Scout troop, in fact, years ago. And I thought that would be perfect, but I didn't know anything about it. What did I know? But I really found my niche. I think local history is just wonderful. And my motto is all history is local. You could really write an essay on that one. And for fun now, I only read history books. I used to read novels, but I haven't read a novel, I think, in 2 years. Because how could any fiction writer create more exciting characters and events than real history? So I did at first when I went to Sully, I decided they needed a book for their bookstore. And so the first book I wrote was Sully Historic Site. And this one to the right is the one that I just have out. By the way, it is available on Amazon. This one on the right really combines my two loves. One is local history, and the second one is genealogy. I've done genealogy for decades. And so I thought this would be wonderful to try to figure out how to find those Sully slaves all the way down to present descendants. So first of all, I'll just tell you a little bit about Sully because that's important to know. It was built in 1793 for Richard Bland Lee, our first Northern Virginia congressman. And as I always tell people who come up the front path, this is not Monticello or Mount Vernon. It's really basically a simple farmhouse. It was preserved though, because of course all the farmhouses were gone. They had been taken by housing developments, shopping centers, and things like that. And although a large part of what was Sully has now been taken for Dulles Airport, in fact, we have airplanes landing all the time, and we wonder whether they're going to land right on top of us. The house is still there and intact. Richard Bland Lee attended the famous first Congress in New York and then Philadelphia, where he met his future wife, Elizabeth Collins. He's one of the many, many Lees of Maryland and Virginia. He was the brother of Light Horse Harry Lee, which if you know Revolutionary War history, he was one of the heroes. And he was the uncle of Robert E. Lee. However, the interesting thing is he was much more interested in running a good farm than he was in politics. We have letters galore written by him to his brother. His brother was overseeing the building of the house, and he was also overseeing the farm. So he was writing to his brother all the time. And you'd think that he'd talk about what was going on or some of the people that were involved. No, he would say, what is the weather? How are the horses and the cows? He wouldn't care a whit about the politics, which is very, very frustrating for present day historians. He did end up on the wrong side of the Compromise of 1790, and I won't go into that. Even if you don't know what that is, that's okay. Compromise was a dirty word then too. And he was voted out and he returned to farming. And he stayed at Sully for about 20 years until he moved to Georgetown to get closer to schools for his children. As you can imagine, Sully out in the middle of nowhere. That wasn't a good thing. And he was also trying to get out of debt. And he prevailed upon his good friend, James Madison, to give him a job as head of Reconstruction after the War of 1812, because it did ruin large parts of Washington, D.C. And then he was a judge at the Orphans Court until he died in 1827. I'll show you a bird's eye view of Sully in its day. And you can see the house, you can see the barn, and right behind the barn, there are three smokestacks going up. And those are where we believe that the three slave cabins were. These were the slave cabins, probably for the slave population that worked in the house. I think we think that the ones that worked in the fields, they lived out in the fields, but these were that. We have rebuilt one of those with period technique and tools, and it's a wonderful job. You can just really feel what it was like. When I first thought about trying to trace Sully's enslaved to their present day descendants, I thought naively, oh, this couldn't be all that much difficult. I would just get all the documents on what the names of the slaves were. And then when I got back to Reconstruction, get back to emancipation, I would look in ancestry.com, because of course that's what I've used for years for genealogy, and I'd find all the families and I'd just put the two ends together and I'd have it. Well, of course that was ridiculously naive. And at every step of my research, I hit road bumps, either lack of information or a lack of knowledge on my part. Because you had to know about terms, you had to read up on slavery related laws that were different in all the states and all the counties. And you had to have, of course, a huge number of resources. Local libraries, historical societies like yours, state archives, the Library of Congress. Now, I was lucky. I just ended my research right before the pandemic hit. And that's really good, because otherwise I'd have to take a hiatus of a year and a half or however long it's going to be before all the libraries get back to working. I did learn a lot about finding enslaved ancestors by joining the Fairfax County branch of the Afro-American Genealogical Group, which continues to meet, by the way, via Zoom during COVID. The first problem that I had was that Sully's chain of ownership was a mess. In a lot of historic houses, you have the same families, children, grandchildren, etc., taking over the plantation or the farms, so that when you come down to emancipation, you have the same group of slaves and their families also, and they usually move not too far away from the farm. Well, that was not the case in Sully. You can see how many people owned Sully. When Richard Bland Lee left, he sold it to Francis. I have France, but that's wrong. Francis Lightfoot Lee was a cousin. And he thought that it was assured that Francis Lightfoot Lee would have it for years and years. However, the poor man had some problem. We don't know what it was, whether he was mentally ill or he had a stroke, but he was unable to take care of the farm, unable to take care of his children, and the whole place deteriorated. It was assigned to what was called a committee to carry out a lot of the things that was happening at the farm, but it was a mess. It was finally sold to an Englishman who, on a trip back to England, he was arrested for forgery and he was sent to Botany Bay, Australia. So you can see the whole farm was a terrible, terrible mess. And rarely, if there were court documents, rarely were slaves ever mentioned. And now at this time also, for further complication, many of Virginia's slaves were transported to the deep South to work on cotton and rice plantations in places like Mississippi and Louisiana. Tobacco was not being grown any longer. It wasn't economic to grow it any longer. It takes the nutrients right out of the soil, and Virginia soil is not that good anyway, and it was a mess. But there were no records of any of these transactions. If they were taken south, no records. Sully didn't become a real working farm again until 1842, when a Quaker family bought it. And according to the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules, they owned slaves, despite the Quakers' aversion to slavery. And they made a good working farm out of it. But it was a complete discontinuity between the slaves when Richard Bland Lee went there and the slaves when the Quakers took it over. In addition to that mess of a chain of ownership, the second problem was that there was no reliable list of Sully's slaves from one owner to the next. Now I'll show you. The list on the left are the slaves that Richard Bland Lee inherited from his father and grandfather. By the way, neither his grandfather or his father lived there. They just sent a bunch of slaves and overseers, and that was it. Okay, so those are his slaves on the left. Now in 1809, Richard Bland Lee thought it necessary to draw up a legal document that listed all of his slaves. And if you look at the two lists, there is absolutely no common name anywhere. So what had happened? Well, of course, some of them had died, those 1790 slaves. We don't know. We've never found any slave graveyards at Sully. So we know that some of them must have died, but we don't know who they were. So all we're left with is that Mr. Lee really traded in slaves, bought them, sold them, whatever. But of course, slaves were property, which meant that if you sold or bought those slaves, you would have to pay taxes on them. So that meant that not a lot of them were counted. It was certainly not ever, I don't think the law ever caught up with anybody that didn't list those slaves, but that's the way it was. So let me just talk here also about the fact that slaves were mostly, as I'm sure you already know, slaves were mostly listed by their first names. And that also was a complicating factor. Sometimes the first names weren't even listed. They'd say a slave boy of 5 years, for instance, that wouldn't tell you anything. And in fact, I was under the impression that a lot of slaves would take the last names of their masters. So I thought, well, that's going to be simple. Although Lee is common in Virginia, at least that would be something. But there have been many studies made, and they have discovered that it was rare that slaves took their master's name. They had what was called secret names, secret last names that they did not tell their masters or any other white person. So we have no idea in most cases what are the last names, say when emancipation comes, what they would have taken. It's even the case that George Washington's slaves, and you would think that, well, this was a very famous man and maybe they would want to take the name Washington. Not one of George Washington's slaves took his name. So with all of these obstacles in the way, only a few of which I've mentioned, it's miraculous that we were able to trace any of Sully's slaves down to the present. In fact, we're proud that we were able to populate the family trees of 3. And you saw how many slaves there were, only 3 that continued down to living descendants. I did, however, find a lot of interesting stories about them, years and years later after they were freed. And I hope that when Sully goes back into operation, we will be able to use these in our tours, because it really does, these were faceless and nameless people. And when we find out something about their lives, we should tell people about them. I can't tell you how I got a new appreciation for the horror and the inhumanity of slavery on this project. It was incredible. The fact that they could be sold to whomever, torn away from their families, transported to another state, sometimes chained together like these coffle gangs. This is a Library of Congress archival picture. And of course, there was no way to take them any other way. You wouldn't they had no trains, they had no trucks. You're not going to let them walk along behind each other. No, you're going to chain them together. The whole thing about being a slave was the uncertainty of your life every single day. And indeed, this is our nation's shame and our stain. Now, Elinor Berry. Okay, Elinor Berry, here we are in Chambersburg. So what part did Chambersburg play in my project? Sully owns a treasure trove of letters written to and from the owners of the house. And one of these letters was written on 22 September 1827 from Chambersburg from Elinor Berry, a former slave. And it was a letter of condolence. And what it said, by the way, the reason I have this map up here is that we believe that Elinor Berry lived somewhere between the St. James AME Church down here and Liberty Street up there, somewhere along South Main Street. Elinor Berry said, "I take this opportunity to let you know that I am well and all my family, and I hope that you and your family are in good health. I have heard that my old master is dead, and am very sorry for it." And the next thing that she said, I think, is very droll. "I thought I was a slave when with you, but I am a greater one now, for I have 12 children, and I have to work very hard to keep them. I am thankful to you for the way you brought me up, for I am able to make my living. I still remain your old servant yet, Elinor Berry." We know that Mrs. Lee, possibly because of her Quaker background, taught a lot of her slaves to read and write, which was very unusual for that time. And in fact, in 1830, the state of Virginia said, "That's enough of that. None of you can teach your slaves any longer how to read and write," because of course, if they escaped, they would be much more marketable. So that was the end of that. That letter is the only reference we have at Sully for Elinor Berry. And it was kind of strange to us about why we hadn't ever heard about her before when that letter was so wonderful. Even her first name, it was not in any of those documents that I showed you. So our question was, well, when was she bought and sold? How can we trace her? Well, one of the docents who was working with me on the project started a search of newspapers in newspapers.com. And I don't know whether you've heard of that, but it's a wonderful resource. And I'm so sorry today that so many local newspapers are going out of business, because these local newspapers are just a wealth of information. We found the most interesting article that we have ever found to date in researching this project. It was from the local Chambersburg newspaper called Public Weekly Opinion of 4 June 1897 by the genealogist and historian George O. Seilhammer, who lived on South Main Street where the Berry family had lived. And he tells about a year before the burning of Chambersburg by Confederate troops, General Robert E. Lee went to pay, he says, quote, "a visit of courtesy." And who did he pay this visit of courtesy to, or he wanted to, was Mrs. Berry. He says, "Mrs. Berry, who lived in the dwelling I have described and who was the only person in Pennsylvania to whom Lee thought it necessary to make a personal visit, was a colored woman, at that time no longer young, but still bright and chipper, very neat in her attire, and with manners that I have never found surpassed even in the best society. She was very popular with the better class of the townspeople. She became a widow long before the war, her husband Dennis Berry having died while his 3 sons, John, Dan, and Ferd, were children. Dan and Ferd, both old men, lived in Chambersburg. They were approaching middle age at the time of the invasion in 1863. When Lee's army entered the Cumberland Valley, the colored people all along the Mason and Dixon line were panic-stricken, and among those that they were able to travel made their way to the Susquehanna. Among those that got away was Mrs. Berry, conveyed by her son Ferd, and so Lee's visit at the Berry house was fruitless. When it became known in the neighborhood that the imposing Confederate officer who had stopped at the Berry house and asked for Mrs. Berry was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, there was a great wonder among the inhabitants of Curstown, which is what that area was called then. And the question is that area of Chambersburg still called Curstown? No.
No.
Okay. Well, Sailhamer explains further that among the slaves of Henry Lee at the time of the birth of his son, Robert E. Lee, was a bright mulatto girl who became the nurse of the infant Robert. A man named Ferdinando Fairfax owned a slave named Dennis Berry, described as a sprightly postilion. And I had to look up the word postilion. I had never heard of it, but it means the person who rides the left-hand front horse of a 4-horse carriage. And this Dennis Berry was the postilion for Ferdinando Fairfax. And he gave Dennis a good education and afterwards his freedom. And according to Sailhamer, Dennis Berry sought Eleanor as his wife and worked diligently for the means to buy her from her distinguished master. Sailhamer explains that because of Henry Lee's indebtedness, he was unable to free her, but Dennis Berry succeeded in obtaining the means that enabled him to buy her. So can you imagine? When we read this, it's amazing. We got all these data points, all of these data points in that one article. The name of Eleanor's husband was Dennis, who her owner had been Henry Lee III, how she was freed and by whom, her husband. And often these kinds of details you hardly ever see. The name of the man who freed her husband, Ferdinando Fairfax, and the name of Eleanor's sons, John, Dan, and Ferd. And you see, I thought when I saw Ferd a number of times that it was Fred, spelled wrong, but it was Ferd because he was named after Ferdinando Fairfax, the man who freed his father. So we had all that, but we didn't have a lot else to fit all the pieces together. So I decided to contact the Franklin County Historical Society, asking if they had more information about the Berry family. And by the way, I had a wonderful day at the Historical Society. People were so nice, got me all of this information, just piles of it. And I couldn't have done any further research without that. And I had been told by the society that a Reverend Bernard Ruffin had been researching the history of Black families in Chambersburg for some time, and they had a copy of the book for sale, his book called Chambersburg Roots of Black Perspective. And strangely enough, Mr. Ruffin had lived very close to me where I live in Great Falls, Virginia, but unfortunately he had died not too long before. I ordered the book, I savored every line for clues to my project, and the first thing to do was to check the story about Eleanor belonging to Henry Lee. So I first called Stratford Hall. Now, I don't know whether any of you have ever been to Stratford Hall. It's in Westmoreland County, Virginia. It is absolutely a beautiful, beautiful home, as you can see from the picture. And they've done a wonderful job down there. It's just with all the exhibits and everything else. And so I asked them if they had any record of Eleanor being a slave there. Now, Stratford Hall is the ancestral home of the Lees. Henry Lee didn't own it. In fact, he was there because his wife was a Lee also, and her family owned it, but they didn't own the place. So the question was, well, who was Eleanor? Because Stratford Hall said that they did not have any record at all of her being the personal property of the house. But they did theorize that perhaps Eleanor was the personal property of just Henry Lee and his wife and didn't belong to the house. And so I went with that explanation. I thought that was a good one. But how did Eleanor become enslaved by Henry Lee's brother, Richard Lanley? Well, when I started to knit all of the time periods together and where these people had been, I discovered that Henry Lee got out of debtor's prison in 1810. He, by the way, he might have been a Revolutionary War hero, but he was a financial mess. He was in debt practically his whole life. He was in debtor's prison twice. And this was one of the reasons why Richard Lanley had to move from Sully, because he kept covering his brother's debts. So Richard Henry Lee got out of prison in 1810. He moved his family to Alexandria, Virginia, and the next year in 1811, Richard Bland Lee moved his family to Alexandria. Alexandria, I meant, is where they both lived. Then the third thing was that triangulating further on Alexandria, the man who freed Dennis Berry, Ferdinando Fairfax, also lived in Alexandria at the same time. So I can just imagine, and a lot of this, by the way, when you knit these things together, a lot of it's imagination, because you're not going to have details for everything. And so you have to just figure out, does it make sense? As an old intelligence analyst, I tell you, I used my ability in that craft for this. I can imagine that driving Ferdinando around town was a good way for Dennis to meet fellow slaves. Ferdinando traveled in the same circle as the Lees. His godparents were George and Martha Washington. Eleanor and Dennis named one of their sons Ferdinand, Ferd for short. Continuing our unbelievable luck, we found another article in a 22 July 1873 Chambersburg newspaper. It was an obituary of a man named George Bell that told when the Berrys went to Chambersburg. Mr. Bell had told others that his family had moved from Fairfax County, Virginia to Chambersburg in company with Dennis Berry and other families in 1814. He remembered this date clearly because they arrived in the evening when all of the town was jubilant over the news just received of the peace having been declared between the United States and Great Britain, the War of 1812. So now to trace the Berry family down to current descendants. I had all of this information. This was the best I had ever had. So I had to be able to do that. So that's when I looked in Franklin County Historical Society. I looked at all the phone books, the obits, newspaper articles, census information. I found enough material on the Berry family to match them with the family tree that I had found on Ancestry.com. The person who posted it knew little of her grandfather or any of her family in Chambersburg, but she had a death certificate of her grandfather that matched with a great grandchild of Eleanor. So there I finally had the two sides of this coming together. Eleanor and Dennis, therefore, were her great, great, great grandparents. I contacted her through Ancestry, and she told me that her grandmother, a Berry, had moved to Maryland decades previous and had lost contact with any Berrys that were left in Chambersburg. And here is the path. Oh, there's Ferdinando, by the way, good-looking gentleman. And here is the family tree. Okay, Eleanor and Dennis up at the top. They had Ferdinand. Ferdinand had Arthur Scott Berry, who was one of Ferdinand's 11 children. Preston Leroy Berry, Arthur's son. Emma Jane Berry, Preston's daughter. There's Emma's daughter and Emma's granddaughter. Since they're both living, I didn't, put any details about their life, except the granddaughter that I contacted with was born in 1996. So there was the whole chain. She was delighted, and she told all her relatives about it, and they were all delighted because, as you know, a lot of people don't even know who their great-grandparents are, much less their great-great-grandparents or further on back. It's not unusual to find that. There's one more bit of research luck to round out the Berry family and emphasize how important the Berry family must have been to the Black community in Chambersburg. Another search in newspapers.com revealed that William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, reported that the first annual convention of the people of color was held in June 1831 in Philadelphia. And believe it or not, it was listed that Dennis Berry from Chambersburg attended. Dennis was elected to a committee to discuss the opening of a college for Black men in New Haven, Connecticut, the first of its kind. The vision was to make this a collaborative effort with Yale, well, it was Yale College then, but later Yale University. The mayor of New Haven, however, called a town meeting immediately to vote on a resolution opposing the Negro College. Can you believe that? I mean, this was in the North, for heaven's sake. A committee composed of a who's who of Yale leaders and New Haven's political elite claimed that the existence of a Negro college would harm Yale College and the other area schools, the Negro college being, quote, incompatible with the prosperity, if not the existence, of the present institutions of learning and will be destructive of the best interests of the city. Can you believe that? After the failure to get buy-in by Yale College and the community, it took more than 20 years before a Black college was founded, and that was in Wilberforce College in Ohio. I did a little research on what happened to those conventions because I thought, I wonder if this Convention of the People of Color became the NAACP or, what. They were held until the Emancipation Proclamation, when the movement was disbanded, because they thought, sadly, that with emancipation, there was no more need for an organization that pressed for Negro rights. So that's the whole story. I just think it's the most incredible story I've ever found. It's the best story in the book. It's just wonderful. Do any of you have any questions?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Do we know why the estate was called Sully? Where did
Yes.
that name come from?
Well, I mean, partly we know. I mean, it is a strange name. And he just, in his correspondence with his brother, one time started calling it Sully and continued to. And we think it's because there was a chateau in France called Sully, a very well-known one. And because we here in the United States do own a lot of our independence to the French who came to our rescue, that it was popular to name things after French places. So we think that's the reason. We don't know. And I'd like you all to come someday and I'll give you a tour if we ever get out of COVID.
I think my brother lives in Northern Virginia, and I'm sure that I have seen Sully Road. I've been on Sully Road.
Yeah. Well, yes, Route 28, which is the big road between Dulles Airport and Sully, you probably would have gone on.
Hey,
Yeah,
Ann,
it's very easy to see, and that's one good thing about it because people know where it is.
My brother's on here, and he wants to say something.
Okay.
and the house,
Yes.
the house where we got married in that you came to was
Yes.
right around the corner from Sully Plantation.
Okay.
Oh.
How about that?
Oh.
I didn't know my brother was on here. I'm glad he is.
Well, as I said, if any of you want to buy the story of Eleanor and Dennis, and it is in the book, which is now for sale on Amazon. It's called Searching for Sully's Enslaved.
Great. I think that's fascinating. That's quite a piece of research. And
Yes,
I
it was-
really appreciate you speaking to us long distance about this.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.